Now you'll hear me say throughout this course that I always shoot in my camera in Adobe RGB color space, and that is because I want as many different colors to be captured by the sensor as possible. Now, given that I also shoot RAW, really, in order to be technically perfect about it, the sensor is picking up everything that it can possibly pick up and sending it to the AD converter. The AD converter is the one that stores it on the chip. Once it comes from the chip into your computer and therefore into your RAW processor, that is the point at which the color space is assigned. And you'll notice here this RAW image coming out of a 5D Mark II indeed does not have a color space enumerated on here because it has not been converted yet. When I do convert it, then this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to convert it with the ICC profile of Adobe RGB 1998 with the W2 2.2 grayscale standard. Now it will be an Adobe RGB image once it's converted into a 16-bit TIFF. Now once it's converted into a 16-bit TIFF, then is when it comes into Photoshop, and it's at this point that things have to be correct within Photoshop in order for you to get the best possible result out of your post work. And let's take a look at how that works. We'll go Edit, Color Settings, and we'll notice here that we really are set up kind of wrong. The default setting for Photoshop is sRGB, and that really kind of is not what you want because the sRGB color space has about 30% fewer colors in it than the Adobe RGB color space does. Think of it as a small box of crayons versus a large box of crayons. Now we'll go ahead and change that. Now once we're changing to the Adobe RGB color space, we want to change our grayscale setting to the Gray Gamma 2.2. It's going to give you much better grayscale images. And then down under color management policies, we always want to preserve the embedded profile. Now should the day ever come that I actually need to shoot in sRGB, which I have never seen that day yet in 31 years of photography, be that as it may, we want to preserve the embedded profile because it's embedded for a reason. Now, I don't want to ask when opening or ask about the missing profile when opening because 100% of my shooting is done in the Adobe RGB color space. 100% of my adjustments are going to be also in the Adobe RGB color space, and then I convert to sRGB as one of the last steps, similar to doing all your processing in TIFF, and then right before it goes to the printer, you then convert to the JPEG, sharpen it, and then send it out. So it's the last step in the process. So it really slows me down to have this dialog box pop up every time there's a conflict. So I just uncheck these. Now you on the other hand may want to know when there's a conflict, but I already know what my workflow is going to be. I know what my output's going to be, and I already know that my working space is Adobe RGB, and I don't need to know when there's a slight conflict. In other words, I'm well aware of what all the color spaces are in every stage of my workflow, and I don't need to be asked whenever there's a conflict. So this is how I'm going to set up my color settings within Photoshop. Now, one thing, let's say you've got this all set and you open an image in Bridge. Let's say this image right here, the nice sunset image. I'll double click and open it in Photoshop. And indeed, this image does have the Adobe RGB color space in it. But now let's say that, for the sake of conversation, this is an sRGB image. And as we have seen, our settings reflect that I don't have to be notified when there is a conflict, and it opens with the sRGB color space. Now, if you were to come in here to color settings and then change to Adobe RGB, that does not render the image as an Adobe RGB color space image. In other words, you're not adding 30% more colors into the image by changing this setting. Just so you know that. The image is always going to have a limitation of the lowest color setting in the process. In other words, if your image comes into the process at sRGB, it's going to stay sRGB all the way through the process. It doesn't matter if you choose Adobe RGB or ProPhoto, Color Match, or whatever. The image will always be sRGB. If you want to change the image to the Adobe RGB color space, you then have to close out the image, then come up to Edit, Color Settings, change the color space to Adobe RGB, then open your image, and indeed you will see a genuine Adobe RGB color space being used throughout the post process. So just so you know, you cannot change the color setting on the workspace within Photoshop after the image is loaded. It will not take effect. So there you have color settings that are very, very important in Photoshop CS6.